I'm gonna be real. I'm gonna be really real. That candle thing has nothing to do with what we're doing. Absolutely not a goddamn thing. But something told me, oh, that'd be really cool to do, don't you think? So I did it, and there we are. Anyway, if you'd believe it, we're recording more Cress. Can't get enough of this damn book. Can't get enough of the Lunar Chronicles series. And every time I try and do a recording, I do it in a big sitting. So then when I come back to it, like each day is the sitting that I do for that. So as frequently as I upload these is as frequently as I'm doing them. And I just can't get enough of this. So I've been reading so much of it, and I had like a day or so there where I didn't. And I was just like, I need more Cress. Anyway, so we're getting more back into it. Chapter 36. They stopped again that night, and Cress was given some bread, dried fruit, and water. She listened to the sounds of the camp outside the van and tried to sleep, but it only came in fits. They started early again the next morning. She became less and less sure that Thorn would come for her. She kept seeing him embracing that other woman, and imagined that he was glad he was no longer he had to bother himself with the weak, naive lunar shell. Even the fantasies that had consoled and comforted her for so many years about the satellite were growing feeble. She was not a warrior, brave and strong and ready to defend justice. She was not the most beautiful girl in the land, able to evoke empathy and respect from even the most hard-hearted villains. She was not even a damsel knowing that a hero would someday rescue her. Instead, she spent the agonizing hours wondering whether she was to become a slave, a servant, a feast for cannibals, a human sacrifice, or whether she would be returned to Queen Lavanna and tortured for her betrayal. Eventually, late in the second day of her entrapment, the van stopped, and the doors were thrown open. Cress cringed at the brightness and tried to scuffle away, but she was grabbed and hauled outside. She landed on her knees. Pain shot up her spine, but her captor ignored her whimpering as he tugged her to her feet and bound her wrists. There we go. The pain soon faded, trounced by adrenaline and curiosity. They'd arrived at a new town, but even she could tell this one had never been as wealthy or populated as Kufra. Modest buildings, the color of the desert, stretched down a sand-spotted road. Walls of red clay, painted indigo and pink, had long been bleached in the sun, their roofs covered with broken tiles. A fenced area not far away held half a dozen camels, and there were a few more wheeled, dirty vehicles stationed along the streets, and she blinked the sun and sand from her eyes. A spaceship sat in the center of town. A rampion. Her heart skipped with frenzied hope, but it was quickly smothered. Even from this distance, she could see that the rampion's main hatch was painted black, not adorned with the lounging lady as had been reported when Thorn's ship landed in France. She whimpered, tearing her eyes away as her captors herded her into the nearest building. They entered a dark hallway. Only a small window in the front let in any light, and it had been caked with wind-blown sand over the years. There was a tiny desk set in a corner with a board of old-fashioned keys hanging on the wall. Cress was shuffled past it and taken to the end of the corridor. The walls reeked with something pungent. Not a bad scent, but too overpowering to be pleasant. Cress's nose tickled. She was pushed up a staircase so thin that she had to follow behind Gina, with Niels behind her. An eerie silence haunted the sand-colored walls. The stench was stronger up here, and a shiver raced down her spine, making goosebumps bloom across her arms. Her fear had bundled itself up in a cluster of nerves at the base of her spine. By the time they reached the last door in the hallway and Gina raised her fist to knock, Cress was shaking so hard she almost couldn't stand. She was surprised to find herself longing for the security of the van. Gina had to knock twice before they heard footsteps in the creak of the door. Niels kept Cress tucked securely behind Gina, and all she could see were the cuffs of a man's brown trousers and worn white shoes with fraying laces.
Gina,
said a man, sounding like he'd just woken up from a nap.
I heard a rumor out of Kufra that you were on your way.
I've brought you another subject. Found her wandering in the desert. A hesitation. Then the man said, without question, a shell. His certainty made Cress squirm. If he had not had to ask, that meant he could sense her, or rather couldn't sense her. She remembered Sybil complaining that she could not sense Cress's thoughts. How much more difficult it was to train and command a person like her, as if it were all Cress's doing. This man was Lunar. She flinched away, wanted to curl up until she was no larger than a grain of sand, until she blew away in the desert and disappeared. But she could not disappear. Instead, as Gina stepped aside, she found herself face to face with a man well into his years. She started. They were face to face. He was barely taller than her. Behind a pair of thin-wired spectacles, his blue eyes widened, looking remarkably lively despite the wrinkles that folded and creased around them. He was balding, with tufts of untamed gray hair that stuck out above his ears. A bizarre déjà vu struck her as if she'd seen him before, but that was impossible. He whipped off his spectacles and rubbed at his eyes. When he replaced them, his lips were puckered and he was examining Cress like a bug for dissection. She pressed to get back against the wall, until Niels grabbed her elbow and yanked her forward. Definitely a shell, the old man murmured. And the phantom, it seems. Cress's heart pounded, a rough, erratic rhythm against her ribcage. I'm asking 32,000 units for her. The man blinked at Gina like he'd forgotten she was there. He stood a bit straighter and made a great fuss about removing his spectacles again, to clean them this time. Cress dug her fingernails into her palm to distract herself from her panic. She stared past the man. A single window was covered in blinds, and there was dust swirling in and out of a beam of sunlight that knifed around them. There was a closed door, presumably a closet, a desk, a bed, and a pile of rumpled blankets in the corner. The blankets were clotted with blood. A chill raced across her skin. Then she spotted the net screen. A net screen she could calm for help. She could contact the last hotel. In Kufra, she could tell Thorn, I will give you 25,000. The man's tone had solidified while he cleaned his glasses, and now was all business. Gina snorted. I will not hesitate to take this girl to the police and have her deported. I'll collect my citizen's reward from them. A mere 15,000 units? You would sacrifice so much on your own pride, Gina? My pride, and to know that one less lunar is walking around on my planet. She said this with a sneer, and for the first time it occurred to Cress that Gina might truly hate her, for no other reason than her ancestry. I'll let her go for 30,000, Doctor. I know you're paying as much for shells these days. Doctor? Cress gulped. This man in no way resembled the finely polished men and women in the net dramas with their crisp white coats and advanced technology. Somehow, the title served to make her more wary, as visions of scalpels and syringes flashed through her mind. He sighed. 27,000. Gina tilted her head back, peering down her nose. Deal. The doctor took her hand, but he seemed to have drawn back into himself. He couldn't look at Cress full on, as if he were ashamed that she had witnessed the transaction. Defiance jolted down Cress's spine. He should be ashamed. They should all be ashamed. And she would not let herself become mere baggage to be bartered for. Mistress Sybil had taken advantage of her for too long. She wouldn't let it happen again. Before these thoughts could become anything more than rebellious anger, she was shoved into the room. Gina shut the door, enclosing them all in the hot, dusty space that smelled of stale chemicals. Make the transfer quick, she said, folding her arms. I have other business to attend to in Kufra. The doctor grunted and opened the closet. There were no clothes inside, but rather a miniature science lab with mystery machines and scanners and a stand of metal drawers that clanked when he opened them. He pulled out a needle and syringe and made quick work of removing its packaging. Cress backed away, arms pulling against her bindings, but Niels stopped her. Yes, let me get the blood sample from her, then I'll make the transfer. Why? Gina said, stepping between them. So you can determine something's wrong with her and compromise our deal? The doctor harumphed. I have no intention of compromising anything, Gina. I merely thought that she would be more complicit while you're here, allowing me to more safely extract a sample. Cress's gaze darted around the room, a weapon, an escape, a hint of mercy in the eyes of her captor. Nothing. There was nothing. Fine, Gina said. Niels, hold her so the doctor can do what he needs to do. No! The word was ripped out of Cress as she stumbled away. Her shoulder collided with Niels and she started to fall backward. But then he was gripping her by the elbow and hauling her against him. Her legs had become soggy and useless beneath her. No! Please! Leave me alone! She pleaded at the doctor and saw such a mixture of emotion on his lined face that she fell silent. His eyebrows were bunched together, and his mouth tightly pursed. He kept rapidly blinking behind his glasses, trying to clear away an eyelash until his gaze fell away from her altogether. There was pity in him. She knew it. She knew this was sympathy he was trying to disguise. "Please," she sobbed, "please let me go. I'm just a shell, and I'm stranded here on Earth, and I haven't done anything to anyone, and I'm nobody. Please just let me go." He did not meet her eyes again, even as he stepped forward. She tensed, trying to back away, but Niels held her firm. The doctor's touch felt papery, but his grip was strong as he took her wrist in one hand. Try to relax," he murmured. She flinched as the needle dug into her flesh, the same spot where Sybil had taken blood 100 times. She bit hard on the inside of her cheek, refusing to so much as whimper. "That was all. Not so awful, was it?" His tone was eerily soft, like he was trying to comfort her. She felt like a bird who'd had her wings clipped and was thrown into a cage. Another filthy, rotting cage. She'd been in a cage all her life. Somehow she'd never expected to find one just as awful on Earth. Earth, she reminded herself as the doctor plodded back across the groaning floorboards. She was on Earth. Not trapped in a satellite in space. There was a way out of this. Freedom was just out that window or just down those stairs. She would not be a prisoner again. The doctor fit the syringe full of her blood into a machine and flipped on the port screen. "There now. I will transfer over the funds, and you can be on your way." "You're using a secure connection?" Gina asked, taking a step forward as the doctor tapped in some sort of code word. Cress squinted, watching where his fingers landed in case she would later need it. It could save time, not having to hack it. "Trust me, Gina. I have more reason than you to keep transactions hidden from prying eyes." He studied something on the screen before saying more solemnly, "Thank you for bringing her." Gina scowled at his balding head. "I hope you're killing all these Lunars when you're done with them. We have enough problems with the plague. We don't need them too." His blue eyes flashed, and Cress detected a hint of disdain for Gina, but he covered it over with another benign look. "The payment has been transferred. If you would untie the girl before you go." Cress kept still as the bindings were taken off her wrists. She whipped her hands away as soon as they were gone and scurried against the nearest wall. "Lovely doing business with you again," Gina said. The doctor merely grunted. He was watching Cress from the corner of his eye, trying to stare at her without being obvious. And then the door closed, and Gina and Niels were gone. Cress listened to their feet clopping down the hallway, the only noise in the building. The doctor rubbed his palms down the front of his shirt, like cleansing them of Gina's presence. Cress didn't think he could feel half as filthily as she did, but she stayed as still as the wall, glaring. "Yes, well," he said. "It is more awkward with shells, you know. Not so easy to explain." She snarled. "You mean not so easy to brainwash?" He tilted his head, and the odd look had returned, the one that made her feel like a science experiment under a microscope. "You know that I'm lunar." She didn't answer. "I understand you're frightened. I can't imagine what sort of mistreatment Gina and her hooligans put you through. But I am not going to hurt you. In fact, I'm doing great things here, things that will change the world. And you can help me. What is your name, child?" She didn't answer. When he moved closer, his hands extended in a show of peace. Cress shoved all her fear down into her gut and used the wall to launch herself at him. A roar clawed up from her throat, and she swung her elbow as hard as she could, landing a solid hit against his jaw. She heard the snap of his teeth. She felt the shock in her bones, and then he was falling backward and landing so hard on the wooden floor that the entire building shook around them. She didn't check to see if he was unconscious or if she'd given him a heart attack, or if he was in any shape to get up and follow her. She wrenched open the door and ran. It's really friggin' hot. It's a really warm day today, so I had to take a second to go turn on the AC, but my dogs are like, "Let me lay in the sun." So I have the patio open so they can lay in the sun while the AC's running, so screw my electricity bill, but I'm not reading this sweating. Anyway, speaking of sweating, Cress should be sweating because she basically just screwed herself out of a chance to meet with the rest of the team. Because, Dr. Erland was just trying to help. Well, but also, who knows if he was trying to help, because he did kill cyborgs willingly in New Beijing. But she had an opportunity to possibly meet the rest of the crew, and now she's running, so she kind of just screwed herself, but we'll see. Chapter 37. Dr. Erland woke up on the floor of a hot, dusty hotel room, unable for a moment to remember where he was. This was not the laboratories beside New Beijing Palace, where he'd watched cyborg after cyborg break into red and purple rashes, where he'd seen the life drain out of their eyes and cursed the sacrifice of another life, while plotting the next step in his hunt for the only cyborg that mattered. This was not the labs of Luna, where he'd studied and researched with a singular drive for recognition, where he'd seen monsters born at the end of his surgical tool, where he'd watched the brainwaves of young men take on the chaotic, savage patterns of wild animals. Oh, cool. All right. So Dr. Erland created the Wolfmen. All right. Hell of a reveal. Dope. I'm down with it. Let's go. He was not Dr. Dmitri Erland, as he'd been in New Beijing. He was not Dr. Sage Darnell, as he'd been on Luna. Oh, so his real name's Darnell. Okay. Or perhaps he was. He couldn't think, couldn't remember, didn't care. His thoughts kept turning away from himself and his two hateful identities, and swarming back to his wife's heart-shaped face and honey blonde hair that became frizzy whenever the ecology department was injecting new humidity into Luna's controlled atmosphere. His thoughts were on a screaming baby, 4 days old and confirmed a shell, as his wife dropped her into the hands of Thaumaturge Mira, with all the coldness and disgust she would have shown a rodent. This is the last time he'd seen his little crescent moon. Right. And the words crescent moon are capitalized, meaning it's a name, which tells me that that's her name. And then her name is Cress. Cress is Dr. Erland's daughter. I think I called this in a previous episode. I really hope so. But yeah, okay, cool. So Dr. Erland not only created the Wolfmen, but Cress is his daughter. Fucking sick. He watched the whirling ceiling fan that did nothing to dispel the desert heat and wondered why, after all these years, his hallucinations had chosen this time to torture him. This shell girl did not really have his wife's freckles or blonde hair. This shell girl did not have his unfortunate height or his own blue eyes. This shell girl was not his daughter, returned from the dead to haunt him. The illusion was all in his mind. Perhaps it was fitting. He'd done so many horrible things. The recent attack against Earth was only the culmination of years of his own efforts. It was through his own research that Luna's previous regime had begun developing an army of wolf hybrids, and through his experiments that Lavana was able to see it to its bloody finale. And then there were all those he'd hurt to find Celine and end Lavana's reign, all those he'd murdered to find Lynn Cinder. He'd been too optimistic to think he could repay those debts now. He tried hard to duplicate the antidote Lavana had given to Emperor Cato. He'd had to try, and for his pains, more sacrifices, more blood samples, more experiments, though now he was forced to find true volunteers when the traffickers couldn't bring him new blood on their own. He had discovered, back in New Beijing, when he'd studied the antidote brought by Queen Lavana, that lunar shells held the secret. The same genetic mutation that made them immune to the lunar tampering of bioelectricity could be used to create antibodies that would fight off and defeat the disease. And so he'd begun gathering shells in their blood and their DNA, using them just as he'd used the young men who would become mindless soldiers for the Queen, just as he'd used the cyborgs who were too often unwilling candidates of the Letimosis experimentation. Of course his brain would do this to him. Of course his insanity would reach such a depth that the hallucinations would return to him the only thing he'd ever cared for, and they would twist reality so that she became just another one of his victims. Just another person bought and discarded. Just another blood sample. Just another lab rat who hated him. His little crescent moon. Over his head, his port screens dinged on his laboratory shelf. It took more energy than he thought he had to pull himself to his feet, groaning as he used his age-polished bedpost for leverage. He took his time, avoiding the truth, partly because he didn't know what he wanted the truth to be. A hallucination he could deal with. He could ride off and continue with his work. But it was her. He could not lose her one more time. But if it was her, he could not lose her one more time. He passed the open closet and pushed aside the window blinds, glancing out into the street. He could see the curve of the ship 2 streets away, reflecting the sunlight as dusk set in. He should get this over with before Cinder came to check on her wolf friend. He had not had any subjects sold to him since she'd been here, and he did not think she would understand. She had such a tough time understanding the sacrifices that had to be made for the good of all. She, who should understand better than anyone. Sighing, he paced back to the small lab setup and the girl's blood sample. He picked up the port screen and clicked on the report generated from the test. He felt woozy as he scanned the data culled from her DNA. Lunar shell. Height, fully grown, 153.48 centimeters. Martin Schultz scale iris pigmentation, 3. Melanin production, 28 out of 100, with localized concentration melanin to face/ephilus. Her physical statistics were followed by a list of potential diseases and genetic weaknesses, with suggestions for treatments and preventions. It did not tell him what he needed to know until he steeled himself and linked her chart to his own, a chart that he had practically memorized for as many times as he'd taken his own blood for experimentation. He sat down on the edge of the bed while the computer ran through the charts, comparing and contrasting more than 40,000 genes. He found himself hoping that the hallucination was true and she was not his daughter, that his daughter had been killed by Sybil Mira, as he'd been led to believe so many years ago. Because if it was her, she would despise him. And he would agree with her. She was gone already, he was sure, but he didn't know how long he'd been unconscious, but he doubted she would stay close. He had already lost that little ghost. Twice now. The port screen finished running the comparison. Match found. Paternity confirmed. He took off his spectacles and set them on the desk and exhaled a long, trembling breath. His crescent moon was alive. Chapter 38. Cress held her breath and listened so hard it was giving her a headache, but all she heard was silence. Her left leg was beginning to cramp from being curled into such an awkward position, but she dared not move for fear she would bump something and alert the old man to her location. She hadn't run from the hotel, though she'd been tempted. She'd known that Gina and the others could still be out there, and running into them would put her right back where she'd started. Instead, she ducked into the third room down the long, slender corridor, surprised to find the door unlocked and the room abandoned. It had the same setup as the doctor's room: bed, closet, desk. But to her chagrin, it was missing a net screen. If she hadn't been so desperate to find a hiding spot, she would have wept. She'd ended up in the closet. It was empty, with a bar for hanging clothes situated below a single shelf. Cress had used all her strength to clamber up onto that shelf, propelling up the closet's side walls with both feet, before squeezing her way into the tiny alcove. She'd used her toes to pull the door shut. For once she was glad of her small size, and she figured that if he found her, she'd at least have the leverage from being so high up. She wished she would have thought to grab some sort of weapon. But her hope was that there would be no need for it. She suspected that when he woke up, he would think she'd run out into the town and he would go searching for her, which should give her ample time to get back to the net screen and contact Thorne at their last hotel. She had lain there for hours, waiting and listening. Though it was uncomfortable, it kind of reminded her of sleeping beneath the bed in the satellite during those long hours when Luna could be seen through her windows. She'd always felt safe then, and the memory brought a strange sense of protection, even now. After a while, she began to wonder whether she'd killed the man. The guilt that sparked in her chest made her angry. She had nothing to feel guilty about. She'd been defending herself, and he was a lunar trafficking monster. Not long after she'd had this thought, she heard shuffling, so quiet it could have been a mouse in the walls. It was followed by a couple of thumps and a groan. Her body seized up again, her right shoulder aching from the way she was lying on it. This had been a mistake. She should have run when she'd had the chance, or she should have used the time that he was unconscious to tap into his net screen. In hindsight, she'd had plenty of time, but now it was too late, and he was awake, and he would find her, and she squeezed her eyes shut, until white specks flickered in the darkness. Her plan had not failed yet. He could still go outside in search of her. He could still leave the building. She waited and waited, breathing in and breathing out. Filling herself with hot, stifling air, her pulse skipped at every sound, every muffled scrape, every wooden thump, trying to create a picture in her mind of what was happening in the room at the end of the hall. He never left his room. He didn't come to look for her at all. She scowled into the darkness. A bead of sweat lobbed its way off her nose. When solid darkness had crept into her closet and, despite the discomfort and stiff muscles, Cress found herself dozing off. She snapped herself awake and determined that she had hidden long enough. Sorry. The old man wasn't searching for her, which seemed absurd. Knowing how much he'd paid for her, shouldn't he have been a little more concerned? Or maybe all he'd really wanted was her blood. It was a peculiar coincidence, given how Mistress Sybil had saved so many non-gifted infants from death, because she'd seen some value in their blood too. She tried not to let her suspicions and paranoia dig any deeper. Whatever the old man wanted, she couldn't stay in this closet forever. Tilting one foot off the shelf, she nudged open the closet door. It squeaked, a sound that was drum-shatteringly loud, and she froze with one leg extended. Waiting. Listening. When nothing happened, she prodded the door open a bit more and shimmied to the edge of the shelf. She lowered herself as gently as she could down to the floor. As the floorboards groaned, she halted again, heartbeat thundering. Waited. Listened. Dizzy and parched, Cress made her way to the corridor. It was empty. She crept to the next door. Again, it was unlocked, but the room looked exactly like the one she just left, abandoned and empty. Her skin was crawling, every sense heightened as she shut the door and moved on to the next. There's a wasp right outside the door. My dogs are out there. I don't want it to get in here. Okay, good news. The wasp didn't get inside. Bad news. They're building a nest on my patio, so I'm going to have to deal with that eventually. Till then. She crept to the next door. Again, it was unlocked. But the room looked exactly like the one she just left, abandoned and empty. Her skin was crawling, every sense heightened as she shut the door and moved on to the next. In the third room, the blinds were closed, but the light from the corridor fell on a net screen hanging in the darkness. She barely stifled a gasp, trembling with anticipation. She shut the door behind her. Then her attention landed on the bed, and she pressed a hand over her mouth. A man was lying there, sleeping, she realized, as she waited for her heartbeat to stop thudding so painfully against her ribs. She dared not move until she could be certain that the rise and fall pattern of his chest was steady and deep. She hadn't woken him. She glanced at the net screen again, weighing the risks. She could slip into the corridor again and keep searching. There were 2 doors on this floor she hadn't opened yet, but they were both back toward the old man's room. Or she could go downstairs and try her luck there. What is this, a choose-your-own-adventure? But every step she took on the old floorboards could alert someone to her presence, and she had no guarantee that any of the other doors would be unlocked, or that they would have the net screens. The minutes ticked by as she stood with one hand on the doorknob, the other over her mouth, trapped by indecision. The man never stirred, never so much as twitched. Finally, she forced herself to take a step toward the net screen. Her gaze darted to the sleeping form again and again, making sure that his breathing didn't change. Net screen, she whispered. On. The screen flickered and she began repeating, net screen mute, net screen mute, net screen... But her command was unnecessary. As the screen brightened, she found herself staring at a map of Earth. Not a net drama or news feed. 4 locations had been marked. New Beijing, Paris, Rio, France. Oh no, hang on. New Beijing, Paris, Rio, France, a tiny oasis town in the northwest corner of Nile Province in the African Union. A sense of coincidence stirred in her, but her brain was already skimming too far ahead to dwell on it. Within moments, she had sent the map away and called up a comlink. She hesitated. The only time she'd ever seen a comm was when she talked to Cinder, using a link that couldn't be traced or monitored. She knew intimately how much access Queen Levana had to Earth's net, and all those comms that Earthens mistakenly believed were private. But she couldn't dwell on that. What interest would Queen Levana have in a single comm link established between 2 small towns in North Africa? She was, no doubt, far too preoccupied with her plans for intergalactic dominance. Net screen, she whispered. Show hotels in Kufra. Her awkward pronunciation brought up a list of 7 possible Kufras. She selected the one with the least distance from her location, and then was faced with the names of a dozen lodging options. Their ads and contact information flashing on the sidebar. She scowled, reading each carefully. None of their names sounded familiar. Show in map. The city of Kufra spilled out across the screen, a satellite-taken photograph that, after a moment of squinting at the brown-tinted roads, began to breach the gaps in her memory. Then she spotted a courtyard outside one of the hotels and, after zooming into the photo, she recognized a lemon tree standing against one wall. She dared to smile and tapped on the hotel's contact information. Establish comlink. Within seconds, she found herself staring at the same clerk who had checked in her and Thorn with Gina's help. She nearly collapsed with relief. Thank you for coming. Shh. Cress waved her arm, silencing the woman, and glanced at the man on the bed. He twitched, but only briefly. Sorry, she whispered. The woman leaned closer toward the screen to hear her. My friend is sleeping. I need to speak with the guest at your hotel. His name is Carswell Smith. I believe he's in room 8. She was glad when the woman's voice dropped low. One moment. She tapped something off screen. Cress jumped at a ping, but the man slept on. An alert appeared in the corner of the net screen. 97. New alerts regarding search. Lynn Cinder. She blinked. Lynn Cinder? I'm sorry, said the receptionist, snapping Cress's attention back to her. Mr. Smith left the hotel yesterday evening after causing a commotion with some of our other guests. Her eyes had become suspicious, and she scanned the dark room with increased curiosity. In fact, we're currently undergoing an investigation, as some witnesses believe he may have been a wanted... Cress canceled the link. Her nerves were writhing beneath her skin, and her lungs felt too small to take in the air they needed. Thorn wasn't there. He'd had to run, and now she had no idea how to find him, and he was being hunted, and he would be captured, and she would never see him again. The screen pinged again. The alerts on Lynn Cinder had increased by 2. Lynn Cinder, New Beijing, Paris, Rio, France. The sequence began to click. Baffled, Cress pulled up the alerts. They were the same news stories she'd been wading through for weeks aboard the satellite. Criticisms and speculations and conspiracy theories and very little evidence. Still, no confirmed sightings. Still, no arrests made, and not even a mention of Captain Thorn, despite what the hotel clerk had said. And then her attention caught on a headline and her legs nearly buckled. She splayed her fingers on top of the desk to keep standing. Lunar accomplice Dmitry Erland, still evading authorities. Dmitry Erland. The lunar doctor who had been on the Letimosis research team. The doctor who had helped Cinder escape from prison. The doctor who was, perhaps, the second most wanted fugitive on Earth. Even more so than Thorn. She knew it was him even before she'd pull up his picture. This was why the old man had struck her as familiar. She had seen him before, but wasn't he supposed to be on their side? She was so engrossed with her unanswered questions that she didn't hear the subtle creaking of the bed until a hand grabbed her. Wolf is awake. It's gotta be Wolf. Who else would it be? Chapter 39. Cress squeaked as she was spun around. She found herself staring into the face that was both handsome and murderous, his eyes glowing in the light of the net screen. Who are you? I'm Evan. Her instinct was to scream, but she smothered it, choking off the noise until it was little more than a whimper. I'm sorry for intruding, she said. I needed a net screen. My friend is in danger, and I need to send a comm, and I'm so sorry. I promise I didn't steal anything. Please don't call for the doctor, please. He seemed to have stopped listening to her, instead sending his steely gaze around the room. He released her arm, but remained tense and defensive. He wasn't wearing a shirt, but he had bandages around his torso that covered him almost as much as a shirt would have. Where are we? What happened? His words were staggered and slurred. He grimaced, squeezing his eyes shut, and when he opened them again, it seemed that he couldn't quite focus on anything. That's when Cress's attention caught on something more terrifying than his faded scars and intimidating muscles. He had a tattoo in his arm. It was too dark to read, but Cress knew instantly what it was. She'd seen them in countless videos and photographs and documentaries hastily cobbled together. He was a lunar special operative, one of the Queen's mutants. Visions of men digging their claws into their victim's chest, locking their jaws around exposed throats, howling at the moon, curled and crawled through her head. This time, she couldn't temper the instinct. She screamed. For full effect. He grabbed her and forced her jaw shut with his enormous hands. She sobbed, trembling. She was about to die. Her body would pose no more resistance to him than a twig. He snarled, and she could make out the sharp points of his teeth. You should have killed me when you had the chance, he said, his hot breath in her face. You turned me into this, and I will kill you before I become another experiment. Do you understand me? Tears began to work their way out of her lashes. Her jaw was aching where he held her, but she was more afraid of what would happen when he let go. Did she think she worked for the doctor? Could it be that he was just one more victim sold off to the old man? He was Lunar, so they had that much in common. If she could convince him that they were allies, maybe she could get away long enough to run. But could these monsters even be reasoned with?
Do you understand me?
Her lashes fluttered, and the door behind them opened. His moves were fast and fluid, and Cress's head spun as the man turned and pulled her in front of him, plastering her against his chest. He stumbled, as if the sudden movement had made him dizzy, but caught himself as light spilled into the room. A silhouette stood in the doorway. Not the old man, but a guard. A lunar guard. Cress's eyes widened with recognition. Sybil's guard. The pilot in Sybil's pod ship who could have saved her, but he didn't. The wolf operative hissed. Cress would have collapsed if his grip hadn't been so firm. Sybil had found her. Sybil was here. Her tears began to spill over. She was trapped. She was dead.
Take one step and I'll snap her neck!
The guard said nothing. Cress wasn't sure he'd even heard the threat. His eyebrows were raised as he surveyed the scene, and he seemed to recognize her. But rather than look victorious, he seemed merely stunned.
What if... Scarlet!
The words were almost incomprehensible beneath the growl.
Where's Scarlet?
Aren't you that hacker? Said the guard, still staring at Cress. The operative's grip tightened.
You have 5 seconds to tell me where she is, or this girl is dead and you're next!
I'm not with them, Cress choked. He doesn't care about me.
The guard raised his hands in a placating gesture. Cress wondered where Mr. Sybil was. When the operative's hold didn't loosen, it occurred to her that both of these men worked for the Lunar Queen. Why would they be threatening each other? Just relax, said the guard. Let me get Cinder or the doctor. They can explain. The operative flinched.
Cinder?
She's out in the ship. His gaze dipped again to Cress. Where did you come from? She gulped, her head ringing with the same question the operative had posed. Cinder.
What is going on here?
She shuddered at the doctor's voice, stronger than it had been during his negotiations with Gina. Then footsteps. The guard stepped aside to let the doctor into the room. Still dark, but for the corridor light. Cress couldn't help but feel a sting of pride to see that she'd left a mark on his jaw. Though lots of good her newfound courage had done her in the end. The doctor froze and took in the scene.
Oh, stars, he muttered, of all the bad timings.
Though the sight of him reignited Cress's hatred, she also remembered that this was not just some cruel old man who traded Lunars for slaves. This was the man who helped Cinder escape. Her head spun.
Let her go,
said the doctor, speaking gently. We are not your enemies. That girl is not your enemy. Please, allow me to explain. Wolf pulled an arm away from her, dragging a hand down his face. He swayed for a moment before recovering his balance.
I've been here before, he muttered. Cinder. Africa.
Loud thumping on the distant staircase intruded on his confusion. Then there was yelling, and Cress thought she heard her name, and the voice. Yeah. Cress! She cried out, forgetting about the vice-like grip around her. Except that it kept her from launching herself towards him. Captain! Cress! The doctor and the guard both spun around as the footsteps barreled down the hall, and they all watched as Captain Thorne, blindfolded, ran right past the door. Captain! I'm in here! Captain! I'm in here! The footsteps stopped and reversed, and he ran back until his cane smacked the door frame. He froze, panting, one hand braced on the jamb. He had a furious bruise across one side of his face, though it was largely hidden beneath the bandana. Cress! Cress! Are you alright? Her relief didn't last. Captain! To your left there's a lunar guard, and on your right is a doctor who's running tests on lunars, and I'm being held by one of Levana's wolf hybrids, and please be careful! Thorne took a step back into the hallway and pulled a gun from his waistband. He spent a moment swiveling the barrel of the gun in each direction, but nobody moved to attack him. With some surprise, Cress realized that the operative's grip had weakened. Thorne furrowed his brow, aiming the gun somewhere near the window. Could you describe all those threats again? Because I feel like I missed something. Thorne? He pointed the gun toward Wolf and Cress between them. Wolf and Cress between them. Who said that? Who are you? Have you hurt her? Because I swear if you hurt her. The lunar guard reached forward and plucked the gun out of his hand. Hey! Furious, Thorne raised his cane, but the guard easily blocked the blow with his forearm. Then he took the cane away too. Thorne raised his fist. That's enough! yelled the doctor. No one is hurt, and no one is going to get hurt! Snarling, Thorn turned to face him. That's what you think, Wolfman. Dr. Wait, Cress, which one is this? I am Dr. Dmitri Erland, and I am a friend of Lynn Cinders. You might know me as the man who helped her escape from New Beijing prison. Thorn snorted. Nice story, except I'm pretty sure I'm the one who helped Cinder escape from prison. Hardly. The man you just hit is also an ally of Cinder's, as this is the Lumpine soldier who is still on heavy painkillers and probably delirious, and who will no doubt pull out some stitches if he doesn't lie down right away. Thorn, the operative said again, ignoring the doctor's warnings. What's going on? Where are we? What happened to your eyes? Thorn cocked his head. Wait, Wolf? Yes. There was a long, long pause before understanding filled Thorn's expression, and he laughed. Aces! Cress, you nearly gave me a heart attack with that wolf hybrid comment. Why didn't you tell me it was just him? Where's Cinder? Asked Thorn. I don't know, said Wolf. And where... I thought Cress said something about Scarlet before? With one arm still loosely tied around Cress's neck, he dragged his free hand down his face, moaning. Just a nightmare? Cinder is here. She's safe, said the doctor. Thorn grinned, the biggest, most enigmatic grin Cress had seen since the satellite. Cress gaped around the room, nearly hyperventilating as her worldview flip-flopped before her. Sybil's guard, who she had last seen on his way to board the Rampion. Could he have betrayed Sybil and joined them? The doctor who had helped Cinder escape from prison. The wolf operative. Only now, with Thorn's recognition, did she realize that this was the man she'd seen on the video feed when they'd first contacted her. And somewhere... Cinder. Safe. They were safe. Thorn held out his hand, and the guard put his cane back into it. Cress, are you all right? He crossed the room and bent down as if he could inspect her, or kiss her, though he didn't. Are you hurt? No, I'm all right. The words were so foreign, so impossible, so liberating. How did you find me? One of Gina's men told me the name of this place, and all I had to do was mention Crazy Doctor to the folks outside, and they all knew just who I was talking about. Hang on, let me try that again. One of Gina's men told me the name of this place, and all I had to do was mention Crazy Doctor to the folks outside, and they all knew just who I was talking about. Knees suddenly weak, she reached for his forearms to stabilize herself. You came for me, he beamed, looking for all the world like a selfless, daring hero. Don't sound so surprised. Dropping the cane, he pulled her into a crushing embrace that tore her away from Wolf and lifted her clean off the floor. It turns out you're worth a lot of money on the black market. Great way to fuck up a kind moment, Thorn. Love it. Love it so much. Chapter 40. Cress stood with her hair pinched back in both hands and the palace blueprint blurring on the net screen before her. She'd been staring at it all day, but her brain kept running in circles. Alright, what if the doctor and I could get some invitations and sneak in as guests, and then Jason could create a diversion, or, no, if you created a diversion and Jason came as one of the staff, but the doctor is so well known. Maybe Jason and I could enter as guests and the doctor, but then how would we... Ugh! She threw her head back and glowered at the ship's metal ceiling with its crossed wires and air ducts. Maybe I'm overcomplicating this. Oh. That's Cinder talking, so I'm going to have to do all that again. Alright. What if the doctor and I could get some invitations and sneak in as guests, and then Jason could create a diversion, or... No. If you created a diversion and Jason came as one of the staff, but the doctor is so well known. Maybe Jason and I could enter as guests and the doctor... But then how would we... Ugh! She threw her head back and glowered at the ship's metal ceiling with its crossed wires and air ducts. Maybe I'm overcomplicating this. Maybe I should go in alone. Yes, because you aren't recognizable at all, said Aiko, punctuating her statement by pulling up Cinder's prison photo in the blueprint's corner. Cinder groaned. This was never going to work. Oh! Cinder! She jolted. What? This just came across the local news feed. Aiko wiped away the blueprint and replaced it with a map of the Sahara Desert. A journalist was speaking in the background as they watched. A circle drawn around some nearby cities with lines and arrows connecting them. A ticker read, Wanted criminal Carswell Thorne spotted in Sahara Trading City. Evades capture. As the journalist jabbered on, Thorne's prison photo flashed on the screen, followed by the words bright and bold. Armed and dangerous. Calm authorities immediately with any information. Cinder's stomach twisted, first with remorse, then with panic. It was a false alarm. Thorne was dead. Someone must have seen a look-alike and jumped to conclusions. It wasn't the first time. According to the media, Cinder had been spotted multiple times in every earthen country, sometimes in multiple locations at once. But that didn't matter. If people believed they'd seen the real thing, then they would come. Law enforcement, the military, bounty hunters. The desert was about to be flooded with people searching for them, and the Rampion was still sitting, obvious and enormous, in the middle of a tiny oasis town. We can't stay here, she said, pulling on her boots. I'll go get the others. Aiko, run the system diagnostics. Make sure we're set for space travel again. She was down the ramp before Aiko could respond, jogging toward the hotel. She hoped it wouldn't take long for the doctor to pack up his things, and Wolf... She hoped his wounds had healed enough that it would be all right to move him. The doctor had started reducing his dosages. Would it be safe to wake him? As she rounded the corner to the hotel, she spotted a girl leaning against an electric vehicle. The car was just old enough to be beat up and grungy, but not old enough to have gained any vintage appeal. On the other hand, the girl was perhaps in her late teens and gorgeous, with light brown skin and braids dyed in shades of blue. Cinder slowed, preparing for a fight. She didn't recognize the girl as one of the townspeople and felt something wrong about her, though she couldn't place it. Was she a bounty hunter? An undercover detective? The girl's expression stayed blank and bored as Cinder approached. No outward recognition. That was good. But then she smiled and twirled one of her silky braids around a finger. Lynn Cinder, such a pleasure. My master has spoken so highly of you. Cinder paused and studied her again. Who are you? I'm called Darla. I am Captain Thorne's mistress. Cinder blinked. Excuse me? He asked me to stay and keep watch over the vehicle, she said. He's just gone inside to be heroic. I'm sure he'll be glad to know you're here. I believe he's under the impression that you're out in space somewhere. Cinder glanced from the girl to the hotel, when it seemed that the girl had no intention of reaching for a weapon or handcuffs or leaving her post against the car. Cinder pushed open the door. She rushed up the stairs, her mind spinning with the girl's words. It was a joke, or a trap, or a trick. It could not be possible that that Thorne was... Her foot slammed into the landing so hard she was almost surprised it didn't crash to the floorboards. As she turned down the corridor, she saw Jason standing outside Wolf's room, arms crossed. Jason, there's a girl down there. She said... He shrugged and gestured toward the room. See for yourself. Using the wall for balance, Cinder joined him in the doorway. Dr. Erland was there, with a sizable bruise on his jaw, and Wolf was awake, and stars above. He was filthy, his clothes ripped and covered in dirt, and his hair as shaggy as it had been the day she met him in his prison cell. His face was bruised, stubble was claiming his jawline, and he wore, of all things, a red bandana around his eyes. But he was grinning, with his arm around the waist of a petite blonde girl, and it was undeniably him. It was a few seconds before Cinder found her voice, and she had to grip the door for him to keep standing. Thorne? His head jerked around. Cinder? What are you... How... Where have you been? What's going on? Why are you wearing that stupid bandana? He laughed. Gripping a wooden cane, he stumbled toward her, waving one hand until it landed on his shoulder. Then he was hugging her, suffocating her against his chest. I missed you too. You jerk! She hissed, even as she returned the hug. We thought you were dead! Oh, please, it'll take a lot more than a satellite plummeting to Earth to kill me. Although, admittedly, Cress may have saved us that time. Cinder pushed him away. What's wrong with your eyes? Blind. It's a long story. Her tongue flailed all around all the questions, stammering to get out, and she finally landed on... When did you have time to take a mistress? His smile faltered. Don't talk about... Oh, his smile faltered. Don't talk about Cress like that. What? Oh, wait, you meant Darla. I won her in a hand of cards. Cinder gawked. I thought she'd make a nice gift for Aiko. You... What? For her replacement body? Because Darla is an escort droid? Slow, gradual understanding. An escort droid. That would explain the girl's perfect symmetry and ridiculously lush eyelashes, and the way her presence felt off, because there was no bioelectricity coming off her. Honestly, Cinder, To listen to you, people would think I'm a helpless flirt or something. Tipping back on his heels, Thorn gestured toward the blonde girl. By the way, you remember Cress? The girl smiled uncontrollably. Only then did Cinder recognize her, now with flaking, sunburned cheeks and hair chopped short and uneven. Hello, said Cinder, although the girl was quick to duck behind Thorn and cast her eyes nervously around all the people in the room. Cinder cleared her throat. And, Wolf, you're awake. Listen, Thorn. You were spotted in a nearby city. They're already pulling together search parties. This whole area is going to be flooded with people searching for us. She faced the doctor. We need to get out of here. Now. Cinder. She tensed. Wolf's voice was rough and desperate. She dared to meet his eyes. His brow was damp with sweat, his pupils dilated. I had a dream where you said... You told me that Scarlet... Cinder gulped, wishing she could avoid the inevitable. Wolf. He paled, seeing it in her face before she spoke. It wasn't a dream. She was taken, she murmured. Wait, what? Thorn lifted his head. What happened? Scarlet was taken by the thaumaturge after we were attacked. Thorn cursed. Wolf slumped against the wall, his expression hollow. Silence stole into the room, until Cinder forced herself to stand up straighter, to be optimistic, to not lose hope. We believe she was taken to Luna, she said, and I have an idea for how we can get onto Luna without being seen, and how we can find her and save her. And now that we're all together again, I believe it can work. You just have to trust me. And right now, we can't stay here. We have to leave. She's dead, Wolf whispered. I failed her. Wolf, she's not dead. You don't know that. Neither do you. He hunched over, burying his face behind both hands. His shoulders began to shake, and it was just like before. The way all his energy darkened and thickened around him. The way he seemed empty, missing. Cinder took a step toward him. She's not dead! They'll want to keep her for bait, for information. They wouldn't just kill her. So there's still time. There's time to... His anger flared like an explosion. One moment nothing, then a spark, and then, suddenly, it was burning up, raging and white-hot. He reached for Cinder, turning and pinning her against the wall with such force that the net screen shook and threatened to crash to the floor. Cinder gasped, clamping both hands over Wolf's wrists as he held her suspended by her throat, feet dangling off the ground. The warnings on her retina display were instantaneous, rising pulse and adrenaline and temperature and irregular breathing and... You think I want that? He growled. For them to keep her alive? You don't know what they'll do to her, but I do. In another instant, the fury softened, buried beneath terror and misery. Scarlet. He released her, and Cinder collapsed to the ground, rubbing her neck. Over the tumult in her thoughts, she heard Wolf turn and run, his footsteps crashing across the floor down the hallway toward Dr. Erland's room. When they stopped, there was a short silence that filled up the entire hotel, and then howling. Horrible, painful, wretched howling that sank into Cinder's bones and made her stomach turn. Wonderful, Dr. Erland drawled. I'm glad to see you were so much more prepared this time. Hissing around the pain, Cinder used the wall to pull herself to her feet and glanced around at her friends, her allies. Cress was still behind Thorn, her eyes now wide with shock. Jason was fingering the handle of his knife. Dr. Erland, with his messy gray hair and glasses perched at the end of his nose, could not have looked any less impressed. You all go ahead, she said, her throat stung. Load up the ship. Make sure Aiko is ready to go. After a long, heartbreaking howl, another long, heartbreaking howl shook the hotel, and Cinder steadied herself as well as she could. I'll get Wolf. Yeah. Tough times. Tough times. Chapter 41. Cress followed the guard down the hotel steps. Thorn was behind her, one hand on her shoulder, and the other gripping his cane. She warned him about the last step as she turned down the dark hallway. Dr. Erland was in the back, already wheezing with the exhaustion of carrying his prized lab equipment down the stairs. It was difficult for Cress to focus. She wasn't even sure where they were going. The ship, did Cinder say? At the time, Cress had been filled with horror at seeing the lunar operative snap. His howls were still bouncing off her eardrums. The guard shoved open the hotel door and they all scrambled down onto the rough, sand-covered road. 2 steps later, he froze, thrusting his arms out to catch Cress, Thorn, and the doctor, as they crashed into him. Whimpering, Cress shoved against Thorn and scanned the road. Dozens of men and women dressed in the official uniform of the Commonwealth military had them surrounded, with guns raised. Damn! Commonwealth military works fast. Okay. They filled up the roads and the spaces between the buildings, peered down from the rooftops and around rust-covered pod ships. Cress? Thorn whispered as tension prickled on the stifling air. Military. A lot of them, she murmured. Her gaze landed on a girl with blue hair and instant hatred blossomed inside her chest. What is she doing here? What? Who? That girl from the last town. Thorn tilted his head. That's Darla, the escort droid. Why are you and Cinder so confused about this? Her eyes widened. She was an escort droid? The girl was watching them without emotion, sandwiched between 2 soldiers with her hands hanging limp at her sides. I am sorry, Master, she said, her voice carrying through the silence. I would have warned you, but that would be illegal, and my programming prevents me from breaking human laws. Yeah, that's going to be the first thing we fix, said Thorn before whispering to Cress. I have to find one heck of a legal loophole to get her to help me steal that car. A voice boomed, and it took Cress a moment to spot the man holding a port screen and amplifier to his mouth.
You are all under arrest for the harboring and assisting of wanted fugitives. Get down on your stomachs and put your hands on your heads and no one will be hurt.
Stop resisting. Trembling, Cress waited to see what the guard would do. The gun he'd taken from Thorn was still tucked into his belt, but his hands were full of the doctor's stuff.
We have you surrounded,
The man continued when no one moved.
there is nowhere to run. Get down now.
The guard moved first, lowering himself to his knees and setting down the bag of medical supplies and the strange machine before settling into the dirt. Gulping, Cress followed suit, sinking down to the hard ground. Thorn dropped down beside her. Stars above, she heard the doctor moan, grumbling as he joined them on the ground. I'm too old for this. Hot and uncomfortable, with rough pebbles pressing into her stomach, Cress set her palms on top of her head. The officer waited until they were on the ground before speaking.
Lynn Cinder, we have you surrounded. Come to the front exit immediately with your hands on top of your head and no one will be hurt.
Cinder released a string of the most creative curses she could think of as the man's voice died away. Oh, there was a break there, by the way, before that line. She left Wolf in the hallway, where he'd been unresponsive to her reminders that having a mental breakdown now wouldn't do anything to help Scarlet. He had sat only curled in on himself with his head tucked against his knees, saying nothing. Ducking into the doctor's hotel room, Cinder inched her way to the window and peeled open the blinds. The rooftop directly opposite the alley had 2 armed military officers with guns pointed right at her. She dropped the blinds and cursed again, plastering herself to the wall. A comm from Aiko appeared in her vision. She pulled it up, already fearing what it would say. Radar is picking up military ships from the Commonwealth. I think we've been spotted. Do you think? She murmured, shutting her eyes. She jotted back a fast message, words scrolling across her eyelids as she thought them. At the hotel, surrounded by EC military. Prepare for immediate takeoff. We won't be long. I hope. Letting out a slow breath, she pried open her eyes again. How was she supposed to get a midlife crisis wolf operative, a blind man, and an elderly doctor past all the soldiers without getting anyone killed? I'll tell you what, I'll have a sip of tea to that. Cheers, Cinder. Alright, that wasn't a sip, that was half my tea mug. Oh, that was good tea, though. She doubted the girl would be much help. Cress didn't strike Cinder as the bold, risk-taking type, and Cinder doubted she had much experience fighting her way out of situations like this. She could abandon her friends and make a run for it herself. She could try and control Wolf and use him as a weapon, but even he couldn't take on that many soldiers at once, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill him. She could try to brainwash the soldiers so they would let them pass, but she'd have to abandon Wolf if he didn't come willingly. Outside, the officer repeated his commands again and again like a robot. Squaring her shoulders, she returned to Wolf in the hallway. "Wolf," she said, stooping beside him, "I need you to help me out here." He shifted enough to peer at her over his arm. His green eyes looked dull and faded. "Wolf, please. We need to get to the ship, and there are a lot of people with guns out there. Come on. What would Scarlet want you to do?" His fingers curled, nails digging into his thighs. Still, he said nothing, made no move to get up. The officer's voice boomed again.
You're under arrest. Come out with your hands on your head. We have you surrounded. Stop resisting.
Fine. You leave me no choice. Standing, she forced her shoulders to relax. The world shifted around her as she flipped off the panic and desperation and reached out, instead, for the energy crackling around Wolf. Except this time, it wasn't crackling, not like usual. This time, it was like controlling a corpse. They stepped into the doorway together. At least 60 guns pointed at them that she could see. No doubt more hidden behind buildings and vehicles. Jason, Thorn, Dr. Erland, and Cress were all lying on the ground. 2 streets separated them from the ship. She kept feeding lies to Wolf like medicine from a drip. Scarlet will be fine. We will find her. We will save her. But first, we have to get out of this mess. We have to get to the ship. From the corner of her eye, she saw his fingers twitch, but she didn't know whether he was acknowledging that there was still hope out there, or whether he was just ticked at her for using him like this. Turning him into a puppet, just like the thaumaturge that had turned him into a monster. Yeah, pretty fucked up actually when you think about it that way. Standing on the hotel step with 60 guns trained on her, Cinder realized she was no better than that thaumaturge. This really was war, and she really was in the middle of it. If she had to make sacrifices, she would. Who would you sacrifice, though, is the question. Of anyone there, if you had to assign someone to die, probably Jason. Because think about it. Well, Jason or Thorn, and I love Thorn, but he's blind, so he's not any practical use to the team. Cress is a hacker, which will come in very handy. But then Jason would have to be the pilot, so you'd have to let Thorn die. Dr. Erland, maybe, but apparently he's the one with the grand scheme, and also you're supposed to save your medic, your white mage. Don't fuck with the white mage. You gotta. When you're out of mana, who are you gonna call? Dr. Erland. So, practically, if you were gonna get rid of, yes, Wolf is injured, but he can recover, hopefully. Cinder has to be alive. She's the fucking main character. Cress is a hacker. She has that going for her. Dr. Erland can do medical repairs. So it's Jason has to fly. So, because I guess Cress was learning this whole time. I don't know how true that is. It's got to be Thorn. If anyone's gonna die, it's got to be Thorn. Sorry. I love you, Thorn. You also abandoned Cress, so go fuck yourself a little bit. Love you. What did that make her anyway? A real criminal? A real threat? A real lunar?
Put your hands on your head and walk away from the building. Do not make any sudden movements. We are authorized to kill if necessary.
Cinder coerced Wolf to stay beside her. They walked in unison. Blah, blah, blah. The dusty air clouded around them, sticking to her skin. A dull ache was spreading through her head, but it wasn't anywhere near as difficult to control Wolf as it used to be. In fact, how easy it was made her sick. He wasn't even trying to fight her. "About time," Thorn muttered as she passed. "Cinder, save yourself," hissed Dr. Erland. She tried her best not to move her lips as she spoke. "Can you glamour them?"
Stop right there.
She obeyed.
On your knees now. Keep your hands up.
"Only a few," said Dr. Erland. "Maybe together." She shook her head. "I've got Wolf. On top of that, I can control 1 earthen, maybe 2. She clenched her teeth. Despite what the doctor had said, she couldn't just save herself. It wasn't only loyalty and friendship that made every fiber of her body rebel against the notion that she could just abandon them all. It was the knowledge that without them, she was useless. She needed them to stop the wedding and rescue Kai. She needed them to get her to Luna. She needed them to help her save the world. "Jason, can you control any of them?" "Yeah, right. Yeah, right. She could practically hear his eyes roll. The only way through this is to fight. Thorn grunted. In that case, has anyone seen my gun? I've got it, said Jason. Can I have it back? Nope.
I order you to stop talking.
The man bellowed.
I see any more lips move and that person gets a bullet in their head. Understand? Get down!
Man, did this man work for the LAPD? I love him. Cinder made a point to glare at the man as she took another step forward. Like dominoes pushed over, she heard the unlatching of 16 safety mechanisms around her. Oh, how fucking scary must that be? You just hear everyone take the safety off their gun. Cress whimpered. Thorn's hand fumbled around until it was gripping hers. I have 6 tranquilizers, Cinder said. Let's hope it's enough. It won't be, muttered Jason.
This is your last warning.
Cinder tilted her chin up, fixing her gaze on the man. Beside her, Wolf lowered himself into a fighting position, his fingers curled and ready, all at Cinder's urging. For the first time, she felt a spike of new emotion from him. Hatred, she thought. For her. She ignored it. This is your first warning, she said. Holding Wolf at the ready, she pinpointed one of the earthen soldiers who was standing at the front of the line and plucked out her willpower. The young woman swiveled and pointed her gun at the man who was evidently in charge. The woman's eyes widened in shock as they took in her own rebellious hands. Around her, 6 more soldiers changed targets, aiming at their own comrades, and Cinder knew they were under Dr. Erland's control. And that was all they had. 7 earthly soldiers at their disposal. Jason's gun, Wolf's fury. It would be a bloodbath. Stand down and let us pass, Cinder said, and no one will get hurt. The man narrowed his eyes at her, making a point not to look at his own peer now holding him at gunpoint.
You can't win this.
I didn't say we could, said Cinder, but we can do a lot of damage trying. She opened up the tip of her finger, loading a tranquilizer from the cartridge in her palm, just as a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Her strength was waning. She couldn't hold on to Wolf much longer. If she dropped her control and he snapped again, she didn't know what he would do. Become comatose all over again, or go on a rampage, or turn his anger on her and the rest of their friends. Beside her, Wolf growled. Ugh. That was weird at first. I don't know. Hang on, because I don't know who's talking, so. Fucking. Actually, we can win, said a female voice. Actually, we can win, said a female voice. Cinder tensed. There was a pulse in the air, a ripple of uncertainty. The man with the port screen swiveled around as silhouettes began to emerge from around the buildings. The townspeople are joining in. I love when that shit happens. Creeping down alleyways, materializing in windows and doorways. Men and women, young and old, dressed in their tattered jeans and loose cotton shirts, their headscarves and cotton hats, their tennis shoes and boots. Cinder gulped, recognizing almost all of them from her brief stay in Farafra. Those who had brought her food, those who had helped paint the ship, those who had doodled cyborg designs on their bodies. Her heart lifted for a moment, then plummeted down into her gut. This would not end well.
This is a matter of international security, said the man. You are all ordered to return to your homes. Anyone who defies this order will be held in contempt of justice by the laws of the Earthen Union.
So hold us in contempt after you let them pass. Ow, my neck. Cinder squinted into the glare of the sun, looking for the source of the voice. She spotted the woman from the medical shop, the Lunar whose son had killed himself rather than join Levana's guard. Some of the soldiers divided their guns, pivoting away from Cinder and aiming into the crowd, but the man with the amplifier held up an arm.
These people are wanted criminals. We do not wish to use lethal force to apprehend them, but we will if necessary. I urge you to stand down and return to your homes.
His threat was followed by a standstill, though the few civilian faces Cinder could see didn't appear frightened, only determined. These people are our friends, said the shopkeeper. They came here seeking sanctuary, and we're not going to let you come in and take them. I don't know what voice I gave her, so I'm all over the place. I'm sorry. What were they thinking? What could they possibly do? They may have outnumbered the soldiers, but they were unarmed and untrained. If they got in the way, they would be slaughtered.
You're not giving me a choice,
said the man, his knuckles tightening around the port screen. A bead of sweat dripped down the side of his face. The shopkeeper's tone took on a new venom. You have no idea what it's like to not be given a choice! Her fingers twitched, a gesture virtually unnoticeable. But the effect passed like a shockwave through the crowd. Cinder flinched. Looking around, she saw that many of the townspeople suddenly looked strained, their brows furrowed, their limbs trembling. And all around them, the soldiers began to shift, redirecting their aims, as those controlled by Cinder and Dr. Erland had, until every soldier was targeting his own neighbor, until every soldier had a gun aimed at his own head. That's right, 'cause it's a town full of fucking lunars! Oh, shit! They're glamoring the fucking 60 soldiers that rolled up to fucking take away Cinder and the posse! Yo! That's so fucking cool! Oh, I didn't even think about them doing that! Yo! Let's go! Oh, shit, that's so cool! Their stunned eyes filled first with disbelief and then terror. Only the leader was left standing in the middle, gaping at his own troop. That's what it's like, said the woman, to have your own body used against you, to know that your brain has become a traitor. We came to Earth to get away from that, but we're all lost if Levana gets her way. Now, I don't know if this young lady can stop her, but it seems she's the only one putting any faith into it right now. So that's what we're going to do. Sorry, I fucked up that last bit. Cinder cried out suddenly, pain splitting her skull. Her hold on Wolf and the female soldier snapped. Her knees buckled, but there was an arm suddenly around her waist, holding her up. Panting from the mental exertion, she peered up into Wolf's face. His eyes were bright green again, normal. Wolf! He peeled his gaze away as a gun clattered to the ground. Cinder jumped. The woman she had been controlling was gaping around at her comrades, trembling, not knowing where to look, not knowing what to do. She raised her hands nervously in surrender. Red with anger, the man with the port screen lowered the amplifier. He faced Cinder again, his eyes filled with hatred. Then he tossed his port screen to the ground. Thorn swiveled his head from side to side. Could someone explain to me? Later, said Cinder, letting her weight sink against Wolf. Get up. It's time for us to go. No arguments here, said Thorn as he and the others clambered to their feet. But does someone think they could grab my escort droid? I kind of went through a lot to get her, and... Thorn! Cinder felt lightheaded and weak as they weaved their way through the stalemate. It was like walking through a maze of stone sculptures who carried big guns and followed them with their eyes, writhing inside with fury and distrust. Cinder tried to meet the gaze of the townspeople, but many of them had their own eyes shut tight and were shaking from concentration. They couldn't hold the soldiers forever. Only the obvious Earthins met her look and nodded with scared, fleeting smiles. Not a fear of their lunar neighbors, she thought, but a fear of what would happen if Levana took control of Earth. What would happen if Lunars ruled everything? What would happen if Cinder failed? Jason grabbed the escort droid's wrist and pulled her along after them. That woman was right, Wolf said when they'd broken away from the crowd, and the Rampion, their freedom, rose up from the streets in front of them. There's nothing worse than having your own body be used against you. Cinder stumbled, but Wolf caught her and dragged her a few steps before she found her balance again. I'm sorry, Wolf, but I had to. I couldn't leave you there. I know. I understand. Reaching out, he grabbed a sack out of the doctor's hand, lessening his load as they hurried toward the ship. But it doesn't change the fact that no one should have that sort of power. Yeah. We're one chapter away from book 4, so we're gonna... So, hang on. Before I get to that, I want to gush, because oh my freaking god, that was so goddamn cool! The whole town, the whole freaking town had banded together to not defeat the military, but to gang up against the military. That's so fucking cool. That's so fucking cool. Are you kidding me? It's the fucking best. Holy shit. I never would have thought, because, like, yes, the townspeople were interested in helping Cinder, but I didn't think that they'd be willing to go that fucking far. That's so fucking cool! What? They managed to get away from 60 members of the Eastern Commonwealth military without a single drop of blood spilt. That shit is cool. Chapter 42. The lunar boy couldn't have been more than 8... Hang on, before I get to that, a little more. A little tea. Just a little tea. Another cup of tea down. My bad. Chapter 42. The lunar boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and yet Scarlet was certain that she would wring his neck like a chicken if she ever got the chance. He was, without a doubt, the most horrible child that ever lived. She couldn't help thinking that if all lunar children were like this, their whole society was doomed, and Cinder would be better off letting them destroy themselves. Scarlet didn't know how, exactly, she had ended up the property of Venerable Anotel and his wife and the little monster they'd raised. Maybe it was favoritism from the crown, or maybe they'd purchased her, like an Earthland family might purchase a new android. Either way, for 7 days, she had been the new toy, the new pet, the new test subject. Because at 8 years old, young Master Charleston, was learning how to control his lunar gift. Evidently, Earthens were great fun to practice on, and Master Charleston had a very sick sense of humor. Chained from a collar around her neck to a bolt in the floor. Right on. Scarlet was being kept in what she figured was the boys' playroom. Nice. An enormous net screen took up one of the walls, and countless virtual reality machines and sports tech had been abandoned in the corners, out of her reach. Okay, immediately I'm thinking of was it a Tim Burton movie? I don't know, but the 2000-something Planet of the Apes with the fucking Mark Wahlberg. When there was a scene where the young girl, she was like 9 or some shit like that, was sold to an aristocratic ape family, and the daughter ape owned her and put a collar around her neck and kept her in a cage in the bedroom. And then when Mark Wahlberg and company had to go through their house for some fucking reason, they rescued the girl. And it scared the shit out of the little kid, who started crying because, like, oh my god, I owned a human as a pet, now all these big scary humans are in my room. And it's just like, that's what you fucking get, kid. I'm imagining that right now, and I'm hoping we get that cathartic moment where Scarlet gets to snap this kid's neck because fuck him. That's not me hating on kids, that's me hating on this kid. There's a difference. Fuck this kid. I know nothing about him, I already hate him. His practice sessions were agony. Since she'd come to the Anotel, we'll just go say Anotel, household, Scarlet had had long-legged spiders crawl up her nose, snakes as long as her arms wriggled their way through her belly button and wind their bodies around her spine. Centipedes burrow into her ear canals and creep around the inside of her skull before emerging on her tongue. Scarlet had screamed, she had thrashed, she had gouged her own fingernails into her stomach and blown her nose until it bled in an effort to get the trespassers out. All the while, Master Charleston had laughed and laughed and laughed.
I don't like this fucking kid, and I really hope that this kid gets a bullet between the eyes.
Just wanted you guys to know. It was all in her head, of course. She knew that. She even knew when she was roughly banging her head on the floor to try and knock out the spiders and centipedes. But it didn't matter. Her body was convinced. Her brain was convinced. Her rational mind was overcome. She hated that little boy. Hated him. She also hated that she was starting to be afraid of him. Charleston. His mother appeared in the doorway, temporarily rescuing Scarlet from his most recent infatuation, squinty-eyed ground moles, with their fat bodies and enormous reptilian claws. One had been gnawing at her toes while its talons shredded the sole of her foot. The illusion and the pain vanished, but the horror lingered, the rawness of her throat, the damp salt on her face. Scarlet rolled onto her side, sobbing in the middle of the playroom floor, grateful that the boy couldn't maintain the brainwashing while he was distracted. Scarlet paid no heed to the conversation until Charleston began to yell, and she forced open her swollen eyes. The boy was throwing a tantrum. His mother was talking in a soothing voice, trying to appease him, promising something. Charleston, it seemed, was not appeased. A minute later, he stomped out of the room, and Scarlet heard a door slam. She exhaled with shaky relief. Her muscles relaxed as they never could when the little terror was around. She pushed her red hood and a tangle of curls out of her face. His mother sent her a withering glance, as if Scarlet were as disgusting as a mole, as offensive as a swarm of maggots on the woman's pristine kitchen counters. Without a word, she turned and left the room. It wasn't long before a different shadow filled the doorway, a handsome man wearing a black long-sleeved jacket. A thaumaturge. Scarlet was almost happy to see him. And then it breaks. New section. She was captured during my battle with Lynn Cinder. Oh, no, hang on. This is Sybil Mira talking, I think. She was captured during my battle with Lynn Cinder. This girl was one of her accomplices. The battle in which you failed to either eradicate or apprehend the cyborg? Sybil's nostrils flared as she paced in between Scarlet and the lavishly carved marble throne. She was wearing a pristine new coat and moving with an awkward stiffness, no doubt a result of the gunshot wound. That is correct, my queen. As I thought. Go on. Sybil clasped her hands behind her back, knuckles whitening. Unfortunately, our software technicians have had no success in tracking the Rampion using either the pod chip or the decom chip that I confiscated. Therefore, the primary purpose of this interrogation is to ascertain what information our prisoner might have that will be useful in our ongoing search for the cyborg. Queen Lavanna nodded. Scarlet, kneeling in the center of the stone and glass throne room, had a very good view of the queen, and though part of her wanted to look away, it was difficult. The Lunar Queen was as beautiful as she'd always been told. More, even. Scarlet suspected there had been a time when men would have fought wars to possess a woman of such beauty. Yeah. Well, when you find that girl. These days, Emperor Kai was being forced to marry her in order to stop a war. In her famished, delirious, mind-weary state, Scarlet almost laughed at the irony. She barely swallowed it back down. The queen noticed the twitch of her lips and frowned. Pulse quickening, Scarlet cast her eyes around the throne room. Though she had been forced to kneel, they had not put her in any restraints. With the queen herself present, plus a handful of guards and a total of 10 thaumaturges, Sybil Mira plus 3 in red and 6 in black, she supposed they hadn't been too concerned that she might try to escape. On top of that, the velvet-draped chairs to either side of the throne were filled with at least 50, well, Scarlet didn't know who they were. Jurors? The lunar media? Aristocrats? All she knew was that they looked ridiculous, clothing that twinkled and floated and glowed. Faces painted to look like solar systems and rainbow prisms and wild animals. Brightly colored hair that curled and wisped and defying gravity in order to create massive, elaborate structures. Some of the wigs even housed caged songbirds, even though they were being remarkably quiet. Ah, I see. They're French. With that thought, it occurred to Scarlet that these were all probably glamours that she was looking at. These lunars could be wearing potato sacks for all she knew. Sybil Mira's heels tapped against the hard floor, drawing Scarlet's attention back to her. How long had you been a part of Lynn Cinder's rebellion prior to your capture? She stared up at the thaumaturge, her throat sore from days of screaming. She considered saying nothing. Her gaze flicked to the queen. How long? Said Sybil, her tone already growing impatient. But no, Scarlet did not care to remain silent. They were going to kill her, that much was obvious. She was not so naive that she couldn't see her own mortality closing in around her. After all, there were bloodstains on the throne room floor, streaking toward the wall opposite the queen's throne, or where the wall should have been. But it was instead an enormous open window and a ledge that jutted out, leading to nowhere. They were fairly high up, 3 or 4 stories at least. You break a leg, but you'd survive that. But if you're under the control of a glamour and you're landing on your head, yeah, you're going to die, so good point. Scarlet didn't know what was beyond that ledge, but she guessed it made for a convenient way to dispose of the bodies. Sybil grabbed her by her chin. I suggest you answer the question. Scarlet clenched her teeth. Yes, she would answer. When would she ever be given such an audience again? When Sybil released her, she turned her attention back to the queen. I joined Cinder on the night your special operatives attacked, she said, her voice hoarse but strong. It was also the night you killed my grandmother. Queen Lavanna had no reaction. You probably have no idea who my grandmother was, who I am. Is it relevant to these proceedings? Asked Sybil, sounding annoyed that Scarlet had already hijacked her interrogation. Oh yes, Incredibly relevant. Levana settled her cheek against her knuckles, looking bored. Her name was Michelle Benoit. Nothing. She served 28 years in the European military as a pilot. She received a medal once for piloting a mission here, to Luna, for diplomatic discussions. A slight narrowing of the eyes. Many years later, a man that she had met on Luna showed up at her doorstep with a very interesting parcel. A little girl. Almost dead, but not quite. Oh, fuck, she's gonna reveal to Levana that fucking Celine is alive. Oh, I wonder how this is gonna go. A puckering around the lips. For years, my grandmother kept that little girl hidden, kept her alive, and she ultimately paid for that with her life. That was the night I joined Lynn Cinder. That was the night that I joined the side of the true queen of... Her tongue froze, her jaws and throat icing over. But her lips still managed a smug smile. She'd already said more than she thought Levana would allow, and the fury of the queen's eyes made it worthwhile. The onlookers were rustling softly, no one daring to talk, even as they cast confused glances at one another across the room. Sybil Mira had gone pale as she looked from Scarlet to the queen. I apologize for the prisoner's outburst, my queen. Would you like me to continue questioning her in private? That won't be necessary. Queen Levana's voice was lyrical and calm, as if Scarlet's words hadn't bothered her in the slightest, but Scarlet knew it was a ruse. She'd seen the flash of murder in the queen's eyes. You may continue with your questions, Sybil. However, we are scheduled to depart for Earth tonight, and I would hate to be delayed. Perhaps your prisoner could use a bit more motivation to stay focused on the answers we're interested in. I agree, Your Majesty. Sybil nodded to one of the royal guards that flanked the doors. Moments later, a platform was wheeled into the throne room, and the audience seemed to perk up. Scarlet gulped. On the platform was a large block of ebony wood, intricately carved on all sides, with scores of people prostrating themselves before a man in long flowing robes, who wore a crescent moon as if it were a crown. On top of the block, set amid hundreds of hatch marks, was a silver hatchet. Scarlet was pulled from her feet by two guards and dragged onto the platform. Letting out a slow breath, she lifted her chin, trying to stifle her mounting fear. Tell me, said Sybil, passing behind her, where is Lynn Cinder now? Scarlet held the queen's stare. My ancestors are smiling at me, Lunars. Can you say the same? I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. Scarlet held the queen's stare. I don't know. A beat before her own hand betrayed her. Reaching out and wrapping around the silver handle, her throat tightened. Where is she? Scarlet gritted her teeth. I don't know. Her hand yanked the blade for the wood. You must have talked about the possibility of an emergency landing, a safe place to hide should you need to. Tell me, speculate if you must. Where would she have gone? I have no idea. Scarlet's other hand slammed on top of the block. Fingers splayed out against the dark wood. She gasped at her own sudden movements, finally tearing her gaze away from the queen to look at her traitorous Lynn. Perhaps an easier question, then. Scarlet jumped. Sybil was right behind her now, whispering against her ear. Which finger do you value the least? Scarlet squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to clear her thoughts, to be logical. She tried not to be afraid. I was only their pilot, she said. None of them had any clue how to fly a spaceship. If they tried to go back to Earth, they would have crashed. Sybil's footsteps retreated, but Scarlet's hand remained stretched against the block, the hatchet still hovering in the air. My guard was an accomplished pilot, and he was quite alive when we abandoned the ship. Assume that Lynn Cinder brainwashed him into piloting the ship for her. Sybil came to stand where Scarlet could see her again. Where, then, would she have gone? I don't know! Maybe you should ask him! A slow, pleased smile climbed over the thaumaturge's face. We'll start with your smallest finger, then. Scarlet's arm reared back and she flinched, turning her face away, as if not looking would keep it from happening. Her knees gave out and she collapsed beside the block of wood, but her arms stayed strong, inflexible, the only parts of her that weren't trembling. Her grip on the hatchet tightened, prepared to swing. My queen? The entire room seemed to inhale at the words, so softly spoken that Scarlet wasn't sure she'd really heard them. After a long, long moment, the queen snapped. What? May I have her? The words were faint and slow, as if the question were a maze that needed to be traversed carefully. She would make a lovely pet. Pulse thundering in her ears, Scarlet dared to open her eyes. The hatchet glinted in the corner of her vision. You may have her when we are done with her, said the queen, sounding not at all pleased with the interruption. But then she'll be broken. They're never any fun when you give them to me broken. The room began to titter mockingly. A bead of sweat fell into Scarlet's eyes, stinging. If she were my pet, continued the lilting voice, I could practice on her. She must be easy to control. Maybe I would start to get better if I had such a pretty earthen to play with. The tittering stopped. The frail voice became even quieter, barely a murmur that still carried like a gunshot in the otherwise silent room. Father would have given her to me. Scarlet tried to blink the salt from her eyes. Her breaths were ragged from the strain of trying to take back control of her arms and failing. I said that you may have her, and you may, said the queen, speaking harshly, as if to an annoying child. But what you don't seem to understand is that when a queen threatens repercussions against someone who has wronged her, she must follow through on those threats. If she does not, she is inviting anarchy to her doorstep. Do you want anarchy, princess? Dizzy with fear, with nausea, with hunger, Scarlet managed to raise her head. The queen was looking at someone seated beside her, but the world was blurring, and Scarlet couldn't see who it was. She heard her, though, the lovely voice cutting through her. No, my queen. Precisely. Lavanna turned back to Sybil and nodded. Scarlet didn't have a moment to prepare herself before the hatchet dropped.
Fuck!
I thought that they would be able to keep her from losing the finger. Fuck! Oh my god! Okay, alright, so where do we stand? Cinder and company managed to escape the the Eastern Commonwealth military without a single blood drop spilled. That's great. Everyone's all united. Cress and Thorn found the rest of the gang. That's great. Scarlet is going to now become property of the princess, but lost a finger in the exchange. Okay, that's fine. Better than what fucking Charleston was doing. I want that kid to die. I really hope that kid gets a bullet in the brain. So that kid Charleston helps represent why the Lunars can't have any sort of control over the planet. Because that's what they find fun, because they're fucked up. This book just got really fucking dark. I love it. So we're at now book 4. Okay, we just finished chapter 42. And there's how many chapters in this fucking book? 61. So we have 19-ish more chapters. Cool. Buh. I love these books. It got really dark. Let's see what happens in the next one. And thank you. Thank you for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.